This video is sponsored by World Anvil. A few months ago, I mentioned I was going to be launching 2 new video series this year. One of them is the series where I review campaign settings. I've already put out a video about the Forgotten Realms. I'm sure that video was universally beloved and completely uncontroversial. This is the beginning of the second series, where we're going to talk about villains in TTRPG games. Today we're going to start by establishing a baseline. We're going to figure out what makes a great RPG villain. Now, I'm not going to pretend I'm the absolute expert on villains. You might have some different elements that make villains work great for your group, things that are either not on my list or actively contradict what I recommend. That's totally fine. But I can just say I've had pretty good success with villains in my home games, making antagonists that my players love to hate, and I hope some of this advice can be helpful to you in your own games. I also have to acknowledge that my Critical Role Demystified series has entered the era of the Vox Machina campaign, where we are starting to get some truly excellent villains. Nothing against Kavarn, but he doesn't hold a candle to what's in store for the group. And I think the timing of this video is really handy. Hopefully you'll be able to take the things we talk about in these villain videos and see some of these practices in action in the Vox Machina episodes we discuss. Because Matt Mercer has an incredible mind for D&D villains. And additionally, I think he and I have a lot of similar ideas about what makes a villain great. But today we're just covering some aspects that make a villain stand out and have an impact in your RPG games. The first thing I think a villain needs is clarity. This is honestly so important, more so than anything else on this list. Everything else we're going to talk about is a useful way to make sure your villain feels like a distinct character or ties into the campaign in a meaningful way, but this is more important than all of that. Because first and foremost, your players need to understand your villain. Like, functionally, they need to know what your villain is doing and what they can do about it in order to properly engage with the story in any meaningful way. Without clarity, your players are just dicking around, bumping into mini-bosses and mini-games, and hoping that at some point they're going to do something important by accident. And there can be ways to keep a villain mysterious or even disguised from the rest of the party, and I'll do a whole other video about that. But the party still needs to have something to hang their hat on. They need to either be able to follow what the villain is doing, or at the very least, be able to figure it out. I don't mean they have to be able to figure out the villain's master stroke really early in the campaign. I mean they have to be able to figure out what the villain is doing. Are they stealing fresh corpses? Hunting down the ancestor of their ancient enemy? Trying to find all of the magic gems for their space glove? Your players need to have access to the villain's actions in order to figure out how to interface with them. Your players can't take action against your villain if they don't know what your villains are doing. Maybe, hypothetically, you have a pair of villains. One of them is a vampire, and the other is some sort of evil spellcaster. And they've just come to the capital city to meet with the king and ensure their sovereignty. And now they've gone back to the city they've conquered. Your players might not know what their plan is, but they know the villains are doing something in that city that they don't want other people messing with. Your players know that the villains are conquerors who are also sly political actors. That's still valuable information. The party knows the villains are generally contained to one location, and that what they're doing would draw the attention of the king, so they had to do something about that. And they know how to get more information. Go to where the villains are. That's clarity. That's the kind of thing your players need to know. The simplest way to think of clarity is that this is the plot hook for an adventure. The shape the adventure ultimately takes is still malleable, and there can be mystery still, but your players need to know that they need to do something. Otherwise, they're not going to do anything. Take it from me, someone who ran a game of Princes of the Apocalypse and did such a bad job indicating what the villains were doing that the party wandered off and explored every side quest because they thought they were all more important, or at the least more interesting, than the core plot of the adventure. It's also useful for you to be able to boil down your villain's plans, actions, or agenda into a clear, digestible plan, especially because villainous plans in RPGs are so much harder to manage than they are in movies or TV shows or whatever, because you can't control what the heroes are going to do. It's a lot harder to run one of those complex wheels within wheels plans from Captain America Civil War or Batman vs. Superman, because RPG heroes don't have to follow a script. So if you can simplify your villain's plan into something clear and easy to digest, then not only will the players be able to understand it once they uncover it, but you will also be able to figure out how your villain will respond to the actions of the players as they interact and interfere with the plan. This brings me to the next trait I think a good villain should have: agency. You want the villain to be reacting in some way to the presence of the heroes. There are plenty of adventures where the villain just lurks in the center of their lair and never interacts with the heroes in any meaningful way. But with just a little bit of tweaking, you can give them more agency, more of a presence in the story itself. For example, let's look at Saruman from The Lord of the Rings. It's been ages since I cracked open one of those books, so I'm just going to keep my focus on the movies for this example. On paper, in film, Saruman never really leaves Isengard. He sits in his tower waiting for the heroes to come and defeat him. Except that's absolutely not true. We're even going to disregard the stuff that most of the party doesn't see him do, like communicating with Sauron or coordinating with Wormtongue. Those are cutaways. Just based on the actions the players can hear about, he's still incredibly active in the story without leaving his domain. He's trapping anyone who comes close. We could easily imagine a version of the story where the party has to go and rescue Gandalf or another overly curious NPC from being imprisoned in Saruman's lair. He sends spies to watch the Fellowship and casts spells to try to level the mountain they're hiking across, forcing them to take a different path. He sends a gang of Uruk-hai to abduct the halflings. He positions an informant in Rohan and remotely takes possession of King Theoden. He sends wild men to raid Rohan and sends an army to Helm's Deep. He literally invents gunpowder and builds a bomb. For the purposes of the movie, that's how it's presented. Don't hit me up in the comments about how in the Silmarillion there's a chapter about how gunpowder is made from Tom Bombadil's eyelashes or whatever the fuck. Saruman also burns the forest. A lot of that happens in his cutaways, but I'm still counting it because Pippin sees the smoke rising from Isengard. That's how he knows what Treebeard is going to see when they pass near Saruman's land. It's something the players can find out about. And yes, okay, he is talking to Sauron a lot, and while most of the party besides Gandalf doesn't figure out the details around that until after Saruman is dead, that's still something he's actively doing, and the players do discover it once they're looting his body and figuring out his secrets after he's dead. Spoilers for The Lord of the Rings, I guess. Even Sauron, the most passive, static villain any of us can think of, is still totally active in the story. Dude is just an eye in a tower and a voice in a ring, and he still sends Death Knights out to hunt Frodo a couple of times per movie. Plus, whenever Frodo uses his cool magic item, Sauron gets into his head. And in the third film, once Saruman is off the field, Sauron is the one rallying all sorts of armies against Gondor. Even the fall of Denethor to madness and hopelessness can be directly laid at Sauron's metaphorical feet. Even though the Denethor of the movies isn't seen using a Palantir to communicate directly with Sauron, it's heavily implied that just being so close to Mordor and seeing the evil forming across the way has played a huge role in corrupting Denethor's mind. Now, should your villain leave their lair and go mess with the heroes? Well, maybe, but there's a risk that the villain will wind up getting killed by the party earlier than expected. Now, that might not be a huge issue for your story, that's something we'll probably talk about some other day, but there are some villains who can totally still go and directly cause problems for the party before the big fight, and probably be okay. Dragons that can fly and retreat are well suited for this tactic. And Curse of Strahd, that vampire lord, keeps showing up to screw with the heroes. It's a fantastic way to maintain his agency in the story. Liches are great for this too. As long as their phylactery is hidden, it's not even an issue if they die in combat. But honestly, if you don't want to risk the villain dying early outside of their lair, that's fine. That's why lairs exist, both mechanically and in fiction. They exist to keep villains alive longer. And that still works because the villain can still have a direct influence on the story through minions, mooks, monsters, magic items, messages, and manipulations. Speaking of things that start with M, the next trait a great villain has is a clear motivation. I'm not talking exclusively about the empathetic villains like Killmonger or Magneto, although that video is definitely coming, stay tuned. But the villain just has to want something, to have a clear goal. Even if the party doesn't know what it is, even if they never put the clues together and never figure out what the villain was doing, I think a strong villain only works if you know what they want. I know a lot of the time on this channel I try not to give black and white advice. Fundamentally, so many aspects of running an RPG game come down to taste and style, and figuring out what's right for you. But I really feel strongly about this. If you know what the villain wants, you know what they're willing to do to get it. If you don't have a clear motivation for your villain, then you don't have a good villain. If their motivation is simply that they're evil, you don't have a villain at all. You have a monster. That's fine. Monsters are fine. Monsters are fun. But villains need to have a reason to do what they're doing. Even if their reason is, I worship or serve someone evil, and I will be rewarded for my actions. That's, something. For those curious, this is why I went so hard against the idea of orcs and hobgoblins and whatever else being evil by default. If you can't give your orc chieftain or hobgoblin torture king a reason to do whatever they're doing, if they're just doing evil things because they're evil and that's it, then they're not villains. They're monsters. They're zombies who can talk. They're rabid dogs in the shape of people. That's not a villain. Also, there's the racist subtext of coding an entire group of people as evil, but go check out the other video for that. We get into it there. Now, as a game master, this is already kind of a lot to keep track of, and we're only halfway through the list. And yes, it's true, it can be really daunting to keep your villain's motivations and agenda and actions in mind, while also dealing with the many other things you have to handle as a GM. Thankfully, you don't have to keep all of these notes in your head. You can record them online using today's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is an online toolset that empowers you to record and sort your notes and ideas into professional-looking pages that you can even share with your players as they make discoveries. It's the perfect way to hide your secrets until they're ready to be shared with your players, and being able to toggle between them at the click of a button is a godsend when trying to recall important information. And I know I talk about the Chronicles feature a lot, but it's perfect for exactly this situation. If your villain is managing a complex plan, you can keep track of it on a separate timeline, and refer back to it in a way your players won't see. They can have access to a separate timeline of the world or the campaign, and never see your villain's actions if you don't want them to. If you visit worldanvil.com, link in the description, and use the promo code SUPERGEEK, you can save 40% off of any annual membership. Once again, links in the description, use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout. Thank you so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. Okay, these next 3 traits are a bit more optional, but I think they're a good idea. First, distinctiveness. Your villain needs something to set them apart, some way for the players to identify them. This doesn't have to be a physical description. Honestly, in a role-playing game, visual design is not super important because everyone will essentially see the character differently in their minds. But it can be a specific physical trait, like a scar or a distinctive tattoo. If you're comfortable doing a voice, it could be a certain accent or a tone of voice, maybe a pattern of speech. Maybe they just curse like a sailor, or maybe they specifically never swear. Maybe they're really polite, or maybe they're really dismissive or patronizing of everyone around them. Maybe they just have a certain affectation, like a walking with a cane. Which, look, I'm sorry, if you give them a cane, you have to put a sword or a wand in it. It's the rules. Your players will expect a sword in the cane. You might as well put a sword in the cane just to satisfy their expectations. Anyway, it just helps to be able to give the villain something that your players can use when they're describing the character to each other, on the off chance that they forgot the villain's name. You hope they won't, of course, but you never know. Players forget a lot of names. Now, you don't have to go overboard here. It's so tempting to say, well, okay, let's give the villain a physical characteristic, a fun speech pattern, and a cool costume piece. That can be a lot to give one villain, and it might not all be necessary. Start slow, pace yourself, figure out what works and makes the most sense for your villain. You can give all these things to your villain, but they might not need it. Sometimes one clear distinctive trait is enough to make them stick in the minds of your players. The next one is really, really hard to get right. Thematic relevance. Basically, creating a villain who represents some aspect of the world or reflects some aspect of one of the characters. This is still very optional because you might not even put a lot of work into the core themes of your game or your world, and that's fine. But if you can create a character who represents some aspect of the themes of your story, it works really well. For example, you don't have to be Brennan Lee Mulligan and turn the bad guy of every adventure into a representation of capitalism. But if you're running a game in a world where nobody knows whether or not the gods are real, and then a villain who is pretending to be a priest of a god and pretending to bring hope and peace to the world, but they're actually serving some darker entity, that villain can act as a way to show those themes of the world on display in the campaign. I've got another video coming up in May about building a world around themes, and that includes some commentary about creating thematic villains. Look for that video in a few months. The final trait is another one that's really hard to get right, but it's nice if you can manage it. Make the character a badass. I know, it's just that easy, right? How many of us have spent an inordinate amount of our lives trying to be cool? Thankfully, in a game like D&D, we actually have mathematical approaches we can put into place to make something awesome. You can adjust the hit points and armor class to make a villain more intimidating. I don't personally recommend you make an armor class too high too often because players do enjoy hitting things, but villains are an exception. You can give a villain a halfway decent armor class and it just adds to their allure because they're harder to hit. Or you don't give them ridiculous armor, you give them ridiculous hit points so that when they take a mighty hit, they seem to absorb it with little difficulty. Or you give them an ability that allows them to make an attack back whenever they get hit, or they can literally negate the damage a few times per fight. Which does bring me to an actual useful piece of advice for making villains badass. Give them an ability that nobody else in the campaign has ever been shown to have. This isn't the only way to create a villain, of course. You can make villains who have the same powers as the heroes down to also having class levels, so the players can literally see what it's like to fight someone like them and use their knowledge effectively. For that, check out the one superhero movie where the villain has the same powers as the hero. I can't remember which one that is. But if you want the players to sit up and go, that is badass, make them able to do something that the players haven't seen before. This could be a special fighting skill you made up, like sometimes when they hit you with a sword strike, they can push off your body and jump into the air and come down and strike you again, and you take damage from the sword, plus you take all the villain's falling damage instead of them taking any damage. They break their fall with your body. Or maybe it's an ability a magic item gives them, like a diadem that allows them to redirect arrows with their mind. And once the villain is defeated, the players have access to that item. Maybe it's a way they command their minions, like a bonus action that makes one minion throw another one at you. That would be pretty cool. Maybe it's some sort of magical effect that's always on them, like the ability to regenerate by narratively regrowing limbs. Maybe it's just having access to higher level spells than the party has. That's always effective. This is where I strongly recommend you go looking at other stat blocks for inspiration. Steal from totally different monsters to give your villain something unique. If your players know the Wizards of the Coast material backwards and forwards, look at other 5e publishers' products like Kobold Press or Ghostfire Gaming. Look on the DM's Guild. Look at the monsters people post on Reddit or Twitter. Find something that you don't think your players have seen before, or at least haven't seen in this campaign, and stick it on your villain. And worst case scenario, reskin the character. Your players don't have to know you're just using a Displacer Beast stat block and calling it Ephemerel, Lord Admiral of the Unseelie Court. Describe the power slightly differently, like the fact that Ephemerel is stuck halfway between the ethereal plane and the physical plane, and they might not even make the connection. And even if they do, it will still make the character seem pretty badass. Those are just my suggestions for how to make a great villain for your RPG game, and in the next installment, I think we're going to talk about some of the best D&D villains. But in the meantime, I want to hear from you. What are some other traits that you think make a great villain for an RPG game? Let me know in the comments below. If you'd like to support the channel, there are a few ways you can do that. You can subscribe and ring the bell to get notified about new videos as soon as they come out. I post new videos every Monday and Thursday. You can subscribe to my Patreon. Every new patron at any dollar amount really helps the channel. Today I am posting a poll for the next Patreon exclusive live stream. Anybody who supports me at $3 a month on Patreon, or more, obviously, they can join that live stream and hang out with me for an hour. So if you want to help decide when that live stream is going to be held, come on over to the Patreon. If you can't support me financially, no worries there. You can still join my Discord community and hang out with a bunch of cool people who love these games. And the fourth way to support the channel is by signing up for my newsletter, where you'll get some occasional updates about what I've got going on. You should also check out my recent video about the virtues of running pre-written adventures or running homebrew campaigns. That's a great video. Until next time, play fair and have fun.